January 21st, 1962. Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. Authorities arrive at the burning home of Edward Mapps to discover that his wife Christine has been bludgeoned to death and their 4-month-old daughter Julie Louise has died of smoke inhalation. However, Edward Mapps himself has disappeared. After a warrant is issued for his arrest, Mapps is placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, but he is never found. Decades later, allegations surface that someone else was responsible for the murders, and Edward Mapps might have actually been a victim. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 14 of The Trail Went Cold. I am your host Robin Warder, and we've got a pretty unique case to cover today. As you probably know, I often make mention of the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. I frequent that place a lot, and have taken a few suggestions for cases to cover from its members. Not too long ago, a couple of the posters there suggested doing an episode about a wanted fugitive who has never been caught, and I thought that was a terrific idea. The only drawback, however, is that there usually isn't a lot of mystery to analyze in those stories. We know who committed the crime and why they did it, but the only thing we don't know is where the perpetrator is hiding. But then there are those rare cases in which there's some ambiguity about whether or not the fugitive actually committed the crime they're wanted for. What if someone else committed the crime and the wanted fugitive was actually an innocent victim? Well, believe it or not, there is a case like that involving a perpetrator who made the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. Ever since its inception in 1950, over 900 fugitives have been featured on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and the vast majority of them have been captured. Only 11 of those fugitives have been removed without ever being found. One of them is Edward Howard Mapps, who was added to the list in 1962 for the murder of his wife and 4-month-old daughter. You'd think a man who committed such a heinous crime would never be removed from the list until he was captured or confirmed to be dead, but that's not what happened here. To this day, Edward Mapps has never been found, and there has always been debate about whether or not he actually committed the crime. I previously featured this case in an article I wrote for listverse.com titled 10 Mysterious Cases of Arson That Will Horrify You, which was originally published in February 2014. Regardless of his guilt or innocence, I know the odds of Mapps still being alive today are very, very slim, but I still think this case is fascinating enough to merit an episode. But before we get started, let's get some business out of the way. Just a reminder that The Trail Went Cold runs on a bi-weekly schedule, and a new episode is posted every other Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. If you give us a rating or a review at any of these sites, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure and garner us some potential new listeners. The Trail Went Cold now has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would be incredibly flattered and greatly appreciate it. And we'll be sure to give any of our generous donors a shout out on a future episode. I also wanted to announce an exciting piece of news. The Trail Went Cold was recently given a plug by Megan Good, the administrator of the Charlie Project. She listened to our episode about the Millbrooks twins and gave the podcast a ringing endorsement on her blog. I talked about the Charlie Project on our episode about Loreen Ron, and it is the premier missing persons website on the internet, as it contains some of the most detailed summaries for missing persons cases that you will find. The site has been an invaluable resource for this podcast and a lot of the true crime articles I've written. So if you've never visited the Charlie Project, I'd highly recommend it, though you can get lost there for hours. So thank you very much for the plug, Megan, and I hope you keep enjoying the podcast. So with all that out of the way, let's begin the odd saga of Edward Howard Mapps. Our story begins in 1962 in the borough of Stroudsburg, which is located in Monroe County, Pennsylvania. At 10:48 p.m. on the evening of January 21st, police and firefighters responded to a report of a burning house located on Sarah Street. When they went inside, they found that 10 small fires had been set throughout the house using such debris as paper and clothes. One of the home's owners, 22-year-old Christine Mapps, was found unconscious on the kitchen floor. She had been struck on the head with a blunt instrument and had a fractured skull, so she was immediately rushed to the hospital. The scene became even more horrific when firefighters discovered the body of Christine's 4-month-old infant daughter, Julie Louise, in an adjacent room. The child was lying on a wicker seat underneath a pile of blankets and had died of smoke inhalation. It was apparent that whoever attacked Christine had deliberately started these fires, as the oven door in the kitchen was wide open. The oven had been set to 450 degrees and was pumping gas into the house in an apparent attempt to blow the place up. But ultimately, the firefighters were able to contain the blaze without the entire house burning down. Because all the house's windows were closed, many of the small fires were unable to get oxygen and just burned themselves out. However, someone was conspicuously missing from the scene. 39-year-old Edward Howard Mapps, who was Christine's husband and father of the deceased Julie Louise. The strange thing was that both of the family's vehicles were still parked in an adjacent garage, so if Edward started the fires, what did he use to flee the scene? Well, in spite of this unanswered question, Edward immediately became the prime suspect. The Monroe County District Attorney James Marsh lived near the Mapps home, and when he arrived at the scene and discovered what happened, he immediately took charge. Marsh personally accompanied the police on their search for Edward Mapps, but they couldn't find any trace of him in the area. Less than 3 hours after arriving at the hospital, Christine Mapps died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Bruises were found on her right hand to indicate she had fought off her attacker at some point. District Attorney Marsh did not hesitate to charge Edward Mapps with murder and arson, and a warrant was immediately issued for his arrest. But here's the thing. The only reason Edward was considered the prime suspect was because he was missing. Yet there didn't seem to be any hard, conclusive evidence at the scene to prove he actually committed the crime. But before I continue this story, I should delve a bit into the background of Edward Howard Mapps, who was quite a unique character, to say the least. Edward was born on June 19, 1922, in Passaic, New Jersey, and was the son of a prominent surgeon, so his family was quite well off. He joined the Marines at age 20 and served in World War II, but after the war was over, he spent some time in a naval hospital because he was having mental problems and suffering from hallucinations. He would be diagnosed with schizophrenia and discharged from the service. Now, it's up for debate whether Mapps really was schizophrenic or if he was actually suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder due to his experiences in the war. PTSD really did not become an official diagnosis until 1980, so back then it was easy to diagnose veterans suffering from PTSD with the wrong mental disorder. Anyway, Mapps eventually went to Syracuse University and majored in art. In 1960, he was teaching art classes in Manhattan when he became involved with a young college student named Christine Wolbach, who was 17 years younger than him. In spite of this, the couple apparently fell head over heels in love with each other as they were married within 2 months. They eventually moved to Stroudsburg and had a baby girl named Julie Louise. Edward became known as one of the most colorful characters in the community as he lived a very eccentric lifestyle and was considered to be a beatnik. It's quite amusing to go back and dig up old newspaper articles from this time period as they describe Edward Mapps as this dangerous wanted fugitive, but make sure to mention how he's this unconventional nonconformist because he likes to walk around barefoot in the summer and wear sandals with socks during the winter. Anyway, Edward mostly focused on working as an artist and sculptor and never really worried about holding down a regular steady job since he apparently had quite a nice little trust fund from his wealthy family to live off of. However, in spite of his eccentric nature, most people who knew Edward described him as a very kind, gentle man who often went out of his way to help others. They'd never seen the guy have a serious fight or argument with his wife, or anyone else for that matter. He seemed to adore his wife and daughter, which is why it came as an incredible shock to think he could have murdered them. In fact, on the same night of the crime, Edward and Christine took their child to visit a neighbor, and they all seemed to be in great spirits, showing no signs of any friction whatsoever. So the couple left the neighbor's house at around 9:05 p.m. The fire department were informed about the burning home at 10:48 p.m., and it's estimated that the fire had been burning approximately 40 minutes before they arrived. So in the span of only 1 hour, Edward had somehow gone from being in a good mood to deciding to murder his wife and infant daughter and set fire to their home. On the surface, there just seemed to be no motive whatsoever for him to do this, and nothing for him to gain. But that was not the only weird aspect of this crime. I mentioned before that both of the family's vehicles were still parked in the garage, and that the keys for both cars were also found in their respective ignitions. So what did Edward use as his transportation to get away? Investigators found no record of any buses or taxi cabs passing through the area during this time period, and there was no indication that anyone in the vicinity had given Edward a ride or picked up any hitchhikers matching his description. Even though Edward Mapps was a fairly recognizable figure in the community, there didn't seem to be any reported sightings of him at all that night. But Edward was an avid outdoorsman, so it was theorized that he might have gone off into a nearby wooded area, but the woods were thoroughly searched, along with several caves he could have hidden out in, and no trace of him was found. In addition, Edward also left behind several important items, including his wallet, passport, and some stocks and bonds, so he didn't exactly have a lot of resources with him if he was planning a life on the run. The crime itself did not seem particularly well planned. It seemed like the perpetrator wanted to destroy all the evidence by completely burning down the house, but they did not use any accelerant, and most of the small fires they started just completely burned out because the windows were left closed. The front door was also closed, and not only that, it was locked from the outside. The murder weapon which was used to bludgeon Christine was never found, but investigators did find a bizarre note she had written to her daughter. It read, "Dear Julie Louise, we are still alive, but the day goes badly. I still feel the squirrel cage fantasy and baseless. Edward says you are the base, but that is unfair to you, although much of my work concerns you. But here's the strangest part. Next to Christine's body was a plate stained with blood. Only it turned out to be animal blood. And not only that, but a couple of other items in the house had animal fur on them. The Mapps family did not own any pets, so I haven't the foggiest idea as to why evidence pointing to the presence of an animal would be found at the murder scene. Yet in spite of these strange inconsistencies, Monroe County District Attorney James Marsh had zero doubt that Edward Mapps was the perpetrator. He went on the radio and made a public plea asking Mapps to surrender, promising that he would be allowed to attend the funerals of his wife and daughter if he turned himself in. Marsh's theory was that after all these years of living a carefree lifestyle as an artist, Mapps felt overburdened by the idea of being a responsible husband and father with bills to pay, so he just decided to murder his family before taking off and starting a new life. Here is a particularly unflattering quote about Mapps from a police report which was originally written about him following the murders. "He is a complete sponger, lazy, insolent, and nasty, is not friends with any past acquaintances, and anyone who ever knew him does not speak well of him." Yeah, that last part isn't exactly true, because Mapps was pretty well liked by almost everyone who knew him. Oh, and the same report also concluded that Mapps was probably a homosexual because, well, I have no idea why. He was a flamboyant beatnik artist who murdered his wife and wore socks with sandals, so I guess in their eyes that must have automatically meant he was a homosexual, I guess. Anyway, two people in the community would soon receive phone calls from someone they believed to be Edward Mapps. One of them was a woman named Marcia DeRocco, who claimed she received a call from a man calling himself John Birch, who told her, "You're next." Even though he gave a different name, DeRocco said she recognized the caller's voice as Edward Mapps. The police ultimately dismissed this call as a hoax, but the woman remained insistent it was Mapps. The other phone call was a lot more interesting. In this case, the caller had a conversation with a man named Henry Evans, an acquaintance of Mapps who recognized his voice. The caller said, "When you see Bob, I want you to tell him that I forgive him." Evans then tried to convince the caller to turn himself in, but he said he couldn't because he had too many things to do. Strangely, the caller then changed the subject and started rambling on about a painting Evans had once done for a department store. He then muttered something which sounded like, "Give my love to Julia," before he abruptly hung up. In June 1962, Edward Mapps was officially placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list, but in spite of an intense manhunt, he could still not be found. There were hundreds of sightings of him over the years, but none of them could be verified. The most interesting sighting occurred in August of that same year, when a man matching Mapps' description robbed $3,000 from a bank in Little Falls, New Jersey. Witnesses identified Mapps from photos, and this was considered a credible sighting because the bank was located only 5 miles away from Passaic, the town where Mapps was born. In 1966, someone showed up at the graves of Christine and Julie Louise Mapps and placed flowers there. This occurred the day before the Mapps' wedding anniversary, but no one knows who put the flowers there. One of the strangest developments came in February 1967, when an artist-musician named Ed Sanders appeared on the cover of Life magazine, which was doing an article about the counterculture movement. Sanders bore a striking resemblance to Mapps, and investigators thought he might actually be Mapps under a new identity. However, the lead turned out to be false, and curiously enough, Ed Sanders would go on to write a book about the Manson family only a few years later. In December 1967, James Marsh made the surprising decision to request the removal of Edward Mapps from the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Marsh's rationale was that even if Mapps was caught, there just wasn't enough strong evidence to build a successful prosecution against him. Some speculated that the FBI pressured Marsh to have Mapps' name removed because there weren't any substantial leads, but either way, Mapps was taken off the list. In October 1971, Mapps was legally declared dead. I don't think they ever turned up any hard evidence that Mapps was actually deceased, but this was apparently done so his siblings could move forward with a civil action to settle his estate. In December 1977, the FBI just flat out destroyed their fugitive case file on Mapps, effectively ending their interest in his case. But the local authorities still tried to find him. In fact, in 1989, the new Monroe County District Attorney actually made an attempt to get Mapps featured on America's Most Wanted, but the whole thing never panned out. There really haven't been any credible sightings of Edward Howard Mapps for several decades. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. But this is certainly not the end of this story. In 2008, Stroudsburg's newspaper, the Pocono Record, published a new series of articles about this case and provided some surprising revelations. Remember that phone call Mapps made to Henry Evans in which he said, "When you see Bob, I want you to tell him that I forgive him, and give my love to Julia"? Well, if you're wondering who those people he's referring to are, that would be Christine Mapps' parents, Robert and Julia Wohlbach. And according to those articles, there's a possibility that Robert Wohlbach could have been the real perpetrator. Apparently, in the aftermath of the murders, Edward Mapps had his fair share of supporters who believed he had been kidnapped and murdered by his own father-in-law. The theory goes that Robert Wohlbach murdered Christine and Janet Louise, and then subsequently killed Edward and hid his body in order to frame him for the crime. And why would he do this? Because Robert absolutely hated his son-in-law. When Edward and Christine got married, Robert openly expressed his disapproval. He believed that Edward was nothing but a lazy bum who didn't work and never paid for anything. Shortly after the marriage, Robert and his wife Julia soon moved from New York City to Stroudsburg, which was Robert's original hometown. Edward and Christine also moved to Stroudsburg, and in spite of the internal tension, they were allowed to live in the same house as the Wohlbachs until they could get a place of their own. When they gave birth to Julie Louise, Julia Wohlbach wanted her husband to loan the couple some money for a down payment on a new house, but under no circumstances was Robert going to lend any money to his bum son-in-law. In October 1961, Edward and Robert got into an argument so heated that Robert slapped his son-in-law across the face and told him he would kill him if he didn't vacate the premises by the first week of November. At around the same time, the Woolbox marriage started to fall apart as Robert became hostile and violent towards his wife, who started to believe he was becoming mentally ill. When November rolled around, Julia filed for divorce and their house was completely vacated. Robert moved back to New York City, and Julia moved into her own apartment in Stroudsburg. Edward, Christine, and Julie Louise temporarily stayed at Julia's apartment until they finally made a down payment on their new house on Sarah Street and moved in there. However, before that happened, Robert showed up at Julia's apartment one night in a violent rage, accusing her of having an affair with Edward and blaming his son-in-law for ruining his marriage. When the Mapps family visited their neighbor on the night of the fire, the neighbor claimed they had received a letter from Robert Woolbock, and Edward stated, "I hope he does not come and make us trouble." Now, all of this information about the separation of the Woolbox marriage and Robert's strained relationship with Edward was never released to the public back in 1962. In fact, it seemed the authorities were so certain about Edward Mapps being the culprit that they never even looked at Robert Woolbock as a possible suspect. When Edward made his cryptic phone call to Henry Evans and said, "When you see Bob, tell him I forgive him," was he implying that Robert was the real perpetrator? Well, at the time the murders took place, Robert supposedly had an airtight alibi. He was on a plane from Miami to New York City. When questioned by police, Robert claimed that the flight left Miami at 9:30 p.m. and that he arrived in New York and checked into the Chesterfield Hotel at 3:15 a.m. If that was true, then there's no way Robert could have committed the crime. But some discrepancies began to emerge. Robert told police he used Alaska Airlines for the flight from Miami to New York, but apparently no Alaska Airlines flew out of Miami on the evening of January 21st, and the only airline Robert would have been able to use was Paramount Airlines. When a family friend attempted to contact the Chesterfield Hotel at 4 a.m. to tell Robert about what happened, they claimed that Robert had not checked in, and this friend never actually got a hold of him until 8:10 that morning. Shortly after the alleged phone call from Edward Mapps to Henry Evans, Julia Woolbock was interviewed by police. She said she believed that Edward did make the call, but made a cryptic statement about how she thought he was dead and not too far from Stroudsburg. She wouldn't provide further explanation for that statement, but it's worth noting that the Woolbocks did own a farm located outside Stroudsburg in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. It's unknown if the police ever searched that area for Edward, but it does sound like an ideal place to hide a body if you never wanted anyone to find it. 3 months after the fire, Julia Woolbock went into the house on Sarah Street to retrieve some personal items, and she discovered that all of Edward's sculptures had been smashed. Now, this doesn't mean that the sculptures were actually smashed on the night of the murders, as someone else could have gone into the house after the fact and done it. It's also worth noting that at least one investigator from the FBI believed there might be some truth to Robert's accusation that Julia was having an affair with Edward. 1 year later, Julia took a trip to Puerto Rico, and apparently, this investigator speculated that she was going there to meet up with Edward. So I suppose the big question here is, who was the real killer? Edward Mapps or Robert Woolbock? Well, the problem is that neither theory makes 100% complete sense. Let's make a little comparison here. At the moment, there are currently 2 men on the FBI's 10 most wanted list who murdered their entire family: William Bradford Bishop and Robert William Fisher. If you look into the backgrounds of both those men, you can clearly see that they were ticking time bombs and totally fit the profile of someone who would just snap and kill their wife and children so they could just take off and start all over again. But Edward Mapps, he does not seem to fit that profile at all. Sure, he was a pretty eccentric guy, but by most accounts, he was also a very kind, peaceful, and gentle person. Other than the issues with his father-in-law, Edward didn't seem to have any noticeable problems with his marriage to Christine. He had no known history of violence or abuse, and to this day there are people who knew Edward personally who still don't think he was capable of harming his wife, and especially not capable of harming his infant daughter. I suppose the only sign of any potential marital problems might be that strange letter they found which Christine wrote to Julie Louise, where she said, "We are still alive, but the day goes badly. I still feel the squirrel cage fantasy and baseless." Those do sound like the words of a woman who might be suffering from some sort of postpartum depression and is feeling a little dissatisfaction with her domestic situation. But would this have been serious enough to escalate into murder? Of course, Edward was diagnosed as schizophrenic after World War II, so I suppose it's possible that this otherwise peaceful man could have just had a complete mental breakdown and snapped. But like I mentioned earlier, that diagnosis might have been incorrect, and Edward could have been suffering from PTSD, not schizophrenia. Either way, that doesn't change the fact that he was treated for those issues back in 1945. Because I see no indication that Edward had any serious mental issues after he was discharged from the Marines, at least nothing that would point to him becoming violent and murdering his family over 16 years later. But let's just use Occam's razor here and go with the simplest explanation, that Edward Mapps just snapped and committed the crime. If that's the case, what did he use to get away from the house? The guy left both of his vehicles behind, and there are no confirmed sightings of him leaving Stroudsburg, even though he was a pretty recognizable figure who was known by many people in the community. Since he was known as an outdoorsman, it is possible that Mapps could have lived in the woods for a while, but this is the middle of winter we're talking about here, so how long could he have lasted in those conditions? And it sounds like police did search the woods and comb the area pretty thoroughly. Remember, Mapps didn't get much of a head start because the police arrived at the house only 40 minutes after the fire started, and they issued a warrant for his arrest within hours. It seems amazing that he could have slipped out of town unnoticed if he had no transportation. That said, when police interviewed local residents, there were a surprising number of people, mostly female, who seemed to like Edward so much that they flat out said they would be willing to help him hide, even though that would be a felony. I suppose it's possible he could have had an accomplice who picked him up and helped him flee the area, but as charming as the guy may have been, how many people are willing to aid someone who murdered a 4-month-old baby? While there were hundreds of unconfirmed sightings of Mapps over the years, 3 of them really stand out. The 2 phone calls he allegedly made, and the bank robbery which took place in New Jersey in August 1962. The bank robbery sighting is certainly intriguing, but let's not forget that eyewitnesses make mistakes all the time when it comes to identifying people, so it's possible the robber was someone else other than Edward Mapps. The phone call to Marcia DeRocco from the person who said "you're next" and identified himself as John Birch, I'm inclined to believe the caller wasn't Mapps, and I'd agree with the police's assessment that it was probably a hoax. The woman thought she recognized his voice, but as far as I know, the caller never said anything to specifically indicate that they were Mapps. But the phone call to Henry Evans? That might be the only hard evidence that Mapps was alive in the days following the murders. But I'll get back to that in a second. First, I want to examine the theory that Robert Wohlbach might have been responsible and framed his son-in-law for the murders. Since the guy was supposedly on a plane when the murders took place, you'd think it would be pretty easy to verify his alibi, but this was just a different time. It might be hard to fathom today, but in 1962, you could just go to an airport and buy a plane ticket without identification. So if there was no official record of Robert Wohlbach being on a flight from Miami to New York City that night, that wouldn't necessarily mean his story wasn't true. Now, I did some checking, and there is actually an airport in Stroudsburg called the Stroudsburg-Pocono Airport, which was in operation in 1962. So theoretically, Wohlbach could have hopped on a flight from Miami to Stroudsburg, committed the crime, and then flown to New York City without leaving a paper trail. But of course, I wouldn't be able to tell you the availability of flights to those locations on that particular night. But if this is how it went down, it would help explain some of the discrepancies in Wohlbach's statement, such as the name of the airline he used, and the exact time he checked into the Chesterfield Hotel that morning. However, I don't think they ever uncovered any evidence that Wolbach was in Stroudsburg that night, and there's also the issue of him being physically capable of committing the crime. I don't know what Wolbach's exact age was, but it doesn't sound like he was in the best of health at that time, as he had suffered a serious heart attack the previous July. I suppose it's possible that an older man with health problems could attack a young woman with a blunt instrument and set fire to the house, but would he have been able to abduct or murder Edward Mapps and get rid of the body? Now, at the time, one of Mapps's acquaintances pushed forward the theory to police that Wolbach could have hired someone to commit the murders and dispose of Mapps's body. That's certainly possible, but once again, there's no evidence connecting Wolbach or any other suspects to the crime. And even if Wolbach hated his son-in-law enough to murder him, would he really do the same thing to his own daughter and 4-month-old granddaughter? It doesn't sound like Robert Wolbach was the nicest guy in the world, but was he really capable of doing something that evil? When Julia Wolbach made that cryptic statement to police that she believed Edward was dead, she might have been implying that she thought her ex-husband murdered him. But I really don't think she'd be withholding information or covering up for Robert if she believed he caused the deaths of their own daughter and granddaughter. I guess it's possible that neither Edward nor Robert killed Christine and Julie Louise, and that the crime was committed by an unknown third party. If their intention was to frame Edward for the murders, then the strategy obviously worked since the police never looked at anyone else as a suspect. I know that the door to the house was locked from the outside, which is a strange thing for an intruder to do, but that might have been another attempt at misdirection to make it look like Edward was responsible. But the one aspect of the murder scene which I absolutely cannot explain is the presence of unknown animal blood and animal fur. Those pieces of evidence just do not fit any theory at all. I don't know. Did some crazy, batshit lunatic burst into the house with an animal carcass in their hand while they committed the crime? If you've got a better explanation, I'd love to hear it. But the real wild card in this case is definitely the phone call Henry Evans received. Because if the caller actually was Edward Mapps, then that's indisputable proof that he was still alive after the murders, and it's far less likely that someone else was responsible. Unlike the threatening phone call to Marcia Duraco, this caller provided specific information to suggest they were the real deal. When the caller started rambling about a certain painting Evans had done for a department store, I think that was his way of indicating the call wasn't a hoax. If it was Mapps, then a lot of people take that call as evidence that he committed the murders because he showed no signs of duress or remorse about what happened. Now, when he said the words, "When you see Bob, I want you to tell him that I forgive him," you could easily interpret that as him saying he forgives Robert Wolbach for murdering his family. But you could also interpret it as him forgiving his father-in-law for the hostile relationship they had over the years. It does seem pretty strange that Mapps would leave a message for his in-laws but make no mention at all of his deceased wife and child, which is why I couldn't fully discount the possibility that the caller was not actually him. You see, the person who originally introduced Mapps to Henry Evans was Robert Wolbach. I really don't know how close Mapps and Evans really were, so why would Mapps decide to call him, of all people? Well, even though Evans claimed he recognized Mapps' voice, if Robert Wolbach was the real killer, could it be possible he made the call himself, or had someone else make the call and impersonate Mapps? Was this done to create misdirection and give off the false impression Mapps was still alive? I suppose it's possible, but it seems pretty far-fetched. I have a feeling that Mapps was suffering from PTSD or had undergone a complete mental breakdown before he made the call. He was probably in such a state of shock over the death of his family that he couldn't even acknowledge them at that point. It's possible he really did want to forgive his father-in-law and phoned Evans to pass the message along because Evans and Wolbach were friends. So, I've outlined separate scenarios for Edward Mapps and Robert Wolbach being the real perpetrator. Like I said earlier, neither of them make complete sense, but I think the phone call is what ultimately tipped the scales for me. I'd say the most logical choice to be the guilty party is Edward Mapps. There are some good reasons to suspect Wolbach, but no hard evidence against him. But that phone call is the one piece of evidence to suggest Mapps was alive days after the murders, and I don't see how that's possible if someone else was responsible. It just seems more plausible that Mapps could have snapped, attacked his wife, set fire to the house, left his daughter behind to die, and then just took off. I have no idea why Mapps would have done this, but he was probably not in his right state of mind, which would explain why he left his vehicles behind. In all likelihood, he probably went into the nearest wooded area and managed to elude the authorities. At some point, he made it to a payphone and called Henry Evans, but after that, he probably went back to hiding in the woods before one of two things happened. Either he realized the enormity of what he'd done and decided to commit suicide, or he died of exposure because of the cold winter weather. And if Mapps died in the woods, then that might explain why he's never been found after more than 50 years. There are so many things which can happen to a human body when they die in the wilderness, whether it be the elements or wild animals scattering the remains. Mapps could have easily perished in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, like Julia Wolbach implied. But after all these years, I'm just not sure there would be anything left of him to find. And thus ends the saga of Edward Mapps. This really is a sad story because it does sound like Edward was generally a good guy. Unless he was a complete sociopath and was really good at hiding his dark side, I'd have to guess he was not in his right mind when he committed this horrible crime, and possibly didn't even know what he was doing. Most of the people associated with this case are long dead, so I'm not sure we'll ever know the full truth about what happened. I know it's extremely unlikely that Edward Mapps is still alive today at the age of 94, but hey, if you think you've seen him somewhere, or if you have any information which might help close this case, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, I'd love to hear from you. If you have some interesting information about this case which wasn't covered here on this episode, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Also, be sure to check out The Trail Went Cold on Facebook and Twitter. We're available for download on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Music, so be sure to leave us a rating or a review at any of these places, because that will help us garner more exposure. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide the obligatory shout out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is the managing editor of The Back Row, the website which hosts this very podcast. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at The Back Row. So have yourself a good 2 weeks, and join me next time for another edition of The Trail Went Cold.